Sol 22. Beth stretched in her bunk as she slowly woke up on her own. The absence of alarm clocks and 6 a.m. wake-up calls was the silver lining of being marooned on Mars. Rolling over, she cracked her eyes open to find Mark sitting on the floor, leaning against the bunk across from her, a tablet forgotten in his lap as he beamed at her. "Good morning, sunshine," he greeted with far more enthusiasm than she could deal with before she'd consumed any caffeine. "Ah," she groaned, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Were you watching me sleep? Because I've got to tell ya, that's totally creeper status." "No, I was just waiting for you to wake up," he corrected with a roll of his eyes. "By watching me sleep," she said again, one eyebrow cocked. Mark arched his own eyebrow right back as he lifted the tablet from his lap, giving it a shake in her direction. "A likely story," Beth said with a yawn, still struggling to fully wake up. "So tell me, why were you being a creeper?" "I was waiting for you to wake up," he repeated drolly, "because I had an idea that I wanted to run past you. I swear to God, Watney, if you are about to ask me why the Incredible Hulk doesn't end up pantsless every time he transforms, I will make you sleep in the rover for a week," she grumbled, still not over last night's Aquaman nonsense. "Silly woman, that's easy. Reed Richards invented super stretchy pants for Bruce to wear that would expand and contract with him when he transformed," Mark replied easily. "No, this isn't a comic book science thought, it's a real-world science thought." She groaned, pulling her blanket up over her head. "Please don't make me science before I have my coffee," she pleaded, her voice muffled by the fabric between them. Mark couldn't help but laugh at her. He'd never known anyone in his life that was less of a morning person than Beth Johansson. He climbed to his feet and headed towards the kitchen. "How about I go make you a cup while you say your tearful goodbyes to your pillow, and then I'll tell you my idea." "You are my favorite person in the world," she said sincerely as she poked her face out from beneath her covers. "I'm the only person in the world," he called over his shoulder as he left the room. "Semantics," she yelled at his retreating back. Mark prepared her usual cup of black coffee and took it with him into the lab, sitting down at the station that they were using as their dining table now that they'd turned the majority of the kitchen into a farm. Beth finally shuffled in blurry-eyed, a few minutes later. Mark had to repress a smirk when he saw that she hadn't seemed to be able to manage pants since she was still in her sleep shorts, but at least she did get a sweatshirt on. She also had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders that she was trailing behind her. Slumping into the chair across from him, she made grabby motions at the mug which he helpfully slid across the table until it's within her reach. He knows better than to start speaking right away. Until the caffeine hits her blood system, he might as well be an adult in a Charlie Brown special for all that she would process. Homp 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 homp. He'd seen the glazed over look in her eyes many a time when Commander Lewis would try to brief the crew during breakfast. Beth would always have to double-check with one of them afterwards to make sure that she hadn't missed anything critical. Instead, he waits until she's had a couple sips, amused as always that he can actually see the alertness growing in her eyes as she consumes more and more coffee. "So, I had a really bad idea about how to make water," Mark announced, once he had deemed her awake enough to science. "You did?" Beth exclaimed, her eyes widening excitedly. "Wait, how bad of an idea?" "A really terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea that you're going to hate." Beth sighed and closed her eyes a moment to steel herself. "All right, break it to me." "Hydrazine," Mark said confidently. "Hydrazine," she repeated questioningly. "Yes, I want to turn it into water." Beth blinked at him once, and then again. "You want to convert rocket fuel into water?" "Yes," he confirmed with a firm nod. "I mean break it down. What is water, but hydrogen and oxygen? We know the recipe, take hydrogen, add oxygen and burn. Voila, instant H2O. And each molecule of hydrazine has 4 hydrogen atoms," she said, rubbing at her temples, seeing where Mark was going with this. "Which means for every liter of hydrazine that is left in the MDV we could make 2 liters of water." "Exactly. So your plan is to set rocket fuel on fire," she said evenly. "Inside the hab, the place where we live?" "Yes," Mark nodded again. She was actually taking it better than he thought she would. He'd taken it worse and it was his idea. "You're right, it's a terrible idea and I hate it." "But," he said leadingly, he could tell there was a but coming. "But," she sighed, "you're right. It's a good idea, it should work." I mean, it's a horrible idea and it has a very real possibility killing us horribly, but it's a good idea. Mark just shrugged. She wasn't exactly wrong. But they also didn't really have another choice. They were due for another dirt doubling for a couple days and they were already low on available water that they weren't holding out for emergency reserves. If he tried doubling the dirt without wetting it first, it would all die. Then they would be royally screwed. And I assume you also figured out where you're getting all the extra oxygen from and still leaving us enough to breathe, she asked, resigned. Yeah, he nodded again, the MAV's fuel plant. Of course. She quickly connected the dots, feed the CO2 to the oxygenator and let it do its job. Mark snapped his fingers and tapped the tip of his nose, pleased that she was so easily able to follow his train of thought. At least that part of the equation doesn't lead to potential death by fiery explosion, she sighed. She hadn't even been awake an hour yet and she could already feel a headache building up behind her eyes. I try to limit any plan of mine to only one step that could possibly end in instant death, he joked. Some people might say to me, come on Mark, go big or go home. Show the universe what extremely botany is all about. But I would reply, no, I don't want to show off. Keep the death-defying stunts to a minimum. Give other botanists a chance to hope that they could one day be as cool as me. How magnanimous of you, she replied drolly. Thanks, he said breezily. I try. Beth rolled her eyes even as she hid her grin behind her coffee mug. So how do we start getting this absolutely insane idea rolling? I want to do an EVA to get the fuel plant in the MAV turned back on so it'll start sucking CO2 out of the air again, and then I'm gonna check how many liters of hydrazine are left in the MDV, Mark said, snapping back to the scientist he was. See exactly what we're working with. There's tons, Beth said. I don't remember the exact numbers because descent was the most terrifying 23 minutes of my life, and I was too busy trying not to pee myself to remember the data, but I know that he spent well under expected fuel usage. Martinez is a badass pilot. Mark laughed, he couldn't disagree with either statement. Hell yeah, he is. And he quite possibly may have inadvertently saved our lives because of it. Let's never tell him that, Beth said, her eyes wide. His ego is big enough. Can you imagine how insufferable he'd be? Agreed, Mark replied without even thinking about it, extending his hand so they could shake on it. Do you want help dealing with fuel plant or the hydrazine? Beth asked, once they had sealed their pact. Now Mark shook his head. It's just a matter of restoring power to the MAV base since it turned itself off once the rest of it took off. And I'm just going to see how much hydrazine is left so we know exactly what numbers we're dealing with, then come back inside. Shouldn't take me very long to do either, he told her. I think it's best to leave the extremely volatile and very combustible rocket fuel outside and as far away from the hab for as long as possible. I'll second that decision, Beth agreed easily. See, he said, flashing her a shit-eating grin, as he got up to begin the process of putting on his EVA suit, figuring that there was no time like the present, keeping the death-defying science confined to one step. Beth rolled her eyes as he walked away, calling after him, try not to jinx us, will you? Sol 23. After Mark had come in from checking how much hydrazine was left in the MDV, 292 liters, which was almost 600 liters of water. Way more than they needed. Mark and Beth spent the rest of the day brainstorming and planning. Like, how would they store the hydrogen and oxygen? They wouldn't. It makes more sense to turn it into water as they go. What would they use as a catalyst? Iridium that they could steal from the MDV engine. How long will it take to create 600 liters of water? A long time. The MAV fuel plant can create half a liter of liquid carbon dioxide every hour. Which means it will take at least 25 days to make the oxygen they'll need. Although Mark might be able to beef up the fuel plant compressor to make CO2 faster and save time, but he wouldn't know until they went back outside again and he could take a closer look at the MAV base. What would they create their reaction chamber out of? Lots of plastic bags, duct tape, and parts of Foggle's butchered EVA suit. In a hab full of inflammable objects, what would they use as their pilot light? Martinez's personal item would do the trick. Sorry Rick, you should have taken your shit with you when you left Mars if you didn't want anyone touching / taking / destroying your stuff. And perhaps most importantly, how they would liberate the hydrogen from the hydrazine. Answer, carefully. But that was yesterday. Today had been all about fabrication. They had spent the vast majority of the day getting their cut and paste on. Beth focused on chopping up the largest bags they had and duct taping them back together to create plastic tarping. Then, using a small table that she dragged around the perimeter of the kitchen, she ignored all of Mark's plentiful short jokes while she taped it to the ceiling so it would surround their little farm. If all went according to plan, they were creating their own little makeshift greenhouse, keeping as much moisture inside of it as possible. Meanwhile, Mark worked on building the actual setup they would be using to convert rocket fuel to water. Another couple plastic bags were cut apart and taped back together to create a tent they would put over their reaction chamber. The air hose liberated from Foggle's EVA suit hung from the ceiling by thread he cut out. The already ruined shirt he had been wearing on Sol 6 created a chimney. All he needed was the iridium catalyst from the MDV and the hydrazine itself, both of which they would be retrieving the next morning. They only took a break when then gnawing in their stomachs became too much to ignore, and after a late lunch they went right back to it. This time they could sit at the table as they worked, Mark making sure the math was right in his chemistry equations, while Beth worked on desecrating Martinez's crucifix. "I feel like I'm going to hell for this," she sighed while she manipulated the pliers and screwdriver in her hands to get another long sliver of wood from the cross. "Aren't you an atheist?" Mark said, looking up from the screen in front of him, one eyebrow quirked. "You don't believe in hell?" "Yeah, but even if I don't believe it, I know what it means to Martinez," she explained. "Feels wrong." Reaching across the table, Mark picked up the small metal Jesus figure that she'd pried off the cross first thing. "Well, to be fair, Jesus once turned water into wine just to keep the party going at a wedding, and because his mother asked him to, he countered, spinning the corpus between his fingers. He wasn't practicing, and was more agnostic than anything else these days, but he'd grown up Catholic and knew the stories." He looked down at the figure and spoke directly to it. "Although if you could do us a solid and turn rocket fuel into wine, I'll be in church every Sunday when we get home." Beth laughed. "You and me both." "Regardless," Mark continued, as someone who knew the importance of having the right refreshments, "I'm sure Jesus would be alright if we used a crucifix to turn hydrazine into water so we don't die." "I guess," she shrugged, still concentrating on turning the small cross into smaller splinters. "And there's that whole, God helps those who help themselves. Besides," he continued with a smirk as he pressed the corpus into her hand, "it's not God you need to worry about." Beth looked up at Mark and took in the look on his face. She knew he was just waiting to say something smart-assed, but she just couldn't help herself. "Okay," she sighed, "I'll bite. What do I actually need to be worrying about?" "Martian vampires obviously," he said, the duckleer in his tone. "But I suppose it's a risk we'll just have to take." She looked down at the figure in her hand. "Do you see what I have to put with?" she asked Metal Jesus. "I guess it's a good thing you don't exist, or you'd probably be rolling your eyes at him from heaven or wherever it is that the Son of God hangs out in his spare time." Mark laughed as she set the figure down, and they both went back to their respective jobs. Johansson," Mark said, getting Beth's attention, after working in silence for a few minutes. "Yeah, what's up?" she asked, looking up from her sacrilegious whittling. "Can you do me a favor and double-check my math?" he asked, gesturing the laptop that was sitting in front of him. In all honesty, he probably should have just let her do it from the beginning, since she was the one with the fancy math degree from MIT, but since this was all his idea, she was letting him take lead on the project. Of course, that didn't mean he wasn't going to have her give her approval on everything before they started playing with rocket fuel and fire. "Of course," she said, carefully gathering up all the splinters she had made and dropping them into a small plastic bag, before pulling the laptop across the table so she could see it. She took her time and went over the equations multiple times, looking for any mistakes or oversights while Mark waited patiently. "Looks good," she finally said once she was confident there weren't any errors. "We just have to make sure that whoever ignites the catalyst is wearing their EVA suit. Other than the fact that hydrazine is uber toxic, we wouldn't want the oxygen we're exhaling to upset the chemical balance," she said with a laugh. "That's a really good point," Mark said, the look on his face making it clear that it was only just now occurring to him. "Oh my God, Watney, really?" Beth asked aghast. "You would have blown yourself up." "Well then, it's a good thing I have you here, isn't it?" he offered placatingly. Okay, that just makes me really worried about my second point since I thought the first one was obvious, she said, shaking her head. Yeah, what's that? Well, while your equation to turn the hydrazine into water is technically correct in its pure mathematical form, not all of the hydrogen is going to perfectly convert. Some of it is going to escape into the room as a gas, so we need to deal with that excess hydrogen so we don't turn the Hab into the Hindenburg. Mark bit down on his lips and didn't make eye contact. That's also a really good point. For fuck's sake, Mark. Beth exclaimed, her hands coming up to sink into her hair. So you would have blown yourself up and then you would have turned the Hab into a bomb, blowing both of us up. Chemistry is hard. Beth picked up the tiny metal Jesus and spoke directly to it. Maybe I should start believing in you so I can pray for a miracle that we're both still alive this time tomorrow. How does that sound to you, JC?